I'm here to talk to you about the problem of slavery. It didn't end in the 1860s. It's a social malady that's with us today, and it's increasing in its scope and virulence. The desire to enslave our fellow man is unfortunately intrinsic to the human character. It has been with us since the beginning of time, on every continent and in virtually every culture, from ancient Egypt to Babylon to Greece and Rome, Africa, Asia, Europe, and the United States. Germany and Japan openly practiced widespread slavery only 50 years ago, and the Soviet Union until less than a decade ago. China even today. It's a disease of our human nature, and yet people are under the impression that it no longer exists. I say to you that in a subtle form it exists in America today, and it's becoming less subtle and more manifest. Madison Avenue has just cleaned it up a little bit, dressed it up in new words. The slave master is now Big Brother, someone to protect you, someone to confide in. But it's all the same. He owns your life. This may sound far-fetched, but I think I can prove it. When the IRS allows you a tax deduction, they and their congressional collaborators and the media call it a tax subsidy. In other words, they designate it as a gift to you, a subsidy. The only way they could conceive this terminology is by presupposing that they, i.e. the government, own all the money. Their view is that they're entitled to it all. That which they allow you to keep is their compassionate and generous gift to you. How can this be? You create the money by your efforts, your sacrifice, your creativity, your risk-taking. So how can it belong to them? It's very simple. They own you. They own everything you produce, your money, your house, your thoughts and ideas, your children. If you go to a foreign country to work, you still have to pay the U.S. income tax. You could dig a hole in the middle of Siberia and they'd be entitled to a cut of your wages because in their minds, under their law, they own you. They create arcane and esoteric laws to criminalize you. You may try, but you can't obey them. You can't even understand them without a lot of professional help. You have to run around slavishly collecting little pieces of paper, receipts, 7 years of detailed financial records because you might be called on to give an account of yourself to the big boss man. And if you've made a mistake, he can take everything you have. He loves it that way. That's total power over you, slavery. I don't remember when we, the people, signed over ownership of ourselves. It just gradually happened by them taking more and more of our freedom. But here's the worst part. It's really only just begun. In this modern age, the information age, getting your money is not enough, even though money, don't let anyone deceive you, is the material source of your freedom. Now, however, they want your mind. If you deviate in your thinking, if you commit one of the 10,000 taboos, and they perceive your actions as a threat, they'll come out and kill you. It was the thought police who killed the children at Waco and Ruby Ridge. Neither David Koresh nor Randy Weaver, whatever things might be said about them, had ever mugged anyone, robbed a 7-Eleven, or committed forcible rape or murder. But they did have unorthodox views, and therefore it was necessary to round them up and deal with them. Whatever their crimes were, they could have been arrested and tried openly in a court of law. But that was not the aim of certain factions in the government. These statists wanted a massive demonstration of force to show who was boss. The penalty for resisting is death. After all, we're not free. We belong to the government, and deviant thoughts will not be tolerated. In the aftermath of the horrible Oklahoma City bombing, government propagandists tried to intimidate the people into silence by recklessly linking criticism of the government to acts of murder. Some people ask, how can you fear your government and claim to love your country? Our response is, how can you love your country without fearing your government? Who else holds a counterfeit license to kill, incarcerate, and confiscate for non-crimes? Remember, America is about liberty first and last, not obedience to bureaucrats. The Washington power clique wants you to shut up, get in line, do what you're told to do, and most outrageously, think what you've been told to think. We have hundreds of politicians and thousands of lobbyists crawling all over Washington, thinking of ways to control you, to extend their will over you, to subvert your freedom and replace it with their will, to capture, that is, to steal your life force. And so we should all be very angry, because anger is the engine that drives our will to resist. And without resistance, without awareness, they will take it all. That's not just politically perverse. It's a sin against mankind, because freedom is actually sacred. Drop an ant into a jar and seal the lid. It will spend the rest of its life trying to get out. It has nowhere to go, but it wants to be free. That is its nature. It's the way every living thing is made. Once, a long time ago, I saw something at the zoo, a wolf lying in its cage. I thought about how this magnificent animal was the end product of millions of years of evolutionary design. A nose that could detect the faintest scent, ultrasonic hearing, eyes that could see in the dark, teeth and jaws capable of crushing thick bone, heart and lungs that could run him for hours in a sub-zero blizzard. And yet there he was, lying forlorn and full of despair. He was well fed. He had a clean habitat and water and medical care. So what was the problem? He was sick with the knowledge that his wonderful powers would never be exercised again. And so he lay there, his head on his paws, staring blankly ahead at perhaps some imaginary forest that he could never reach because there were bars around him. They had not killed his body, but they were destroying his soul. God gave Adam and Eve freedom, even though he knew they would invite death into the world. That's how important freedom is in the divine scheme of things. And that's why we urge you to defend it, always.
The infamous Stoic philosopher Seneca once wrote, "Show me a man who is not a slave. One is a slave to lust, another to greed, another to ambition, and all men are slaves to fear." All humans subject themselves to mental enslavement. Historical conquerors, politicians, the CEOs of today, your bosses, all of them rule over many, many people, yet fail to rule their own minds. The most recognizable Stoic philosopher, Marcus Aurelius, wrote in Meditations, "Alexander and Caesar and Pompey, compared with Diogenes, Heraclitus, Socrates. The philosophers knew the what, the why, the how. Their minds were their own. The others? Nothing but anxiety and enslavement." Stoic philosophers look to teach us to think beyond our emotional instability, free us from mental enslavement, free us from the turbulence of our emotions. Aurelius himself faced his own mental demons. Stop allowing your mind to be a slave, to be jerked about by selfish impulses, to kick against fate and the present, and to mistrust the future. How do we overcome mental enslavement? Stoic philosophers hold the keys to understanding a mindset and way of thinking that can be extremely applicable to living a good life, a productive life. The idea of inserting personal responsibility into your personal philosophy. We often want to blame others for our state of mind, our job, our wealth, not having the same privileges as others. But do privilege and wealth truly help you escape mental enslavement? Just look at Hollywood. Look at all of the stories of dysfunctional behaviour in Hollywood, where a star is one bad decision away from being shipped off to Crazy Town. Money and fame cannot buy you mental freedom. We all suffer setbacks in life, events out of our control, losing loved ones, facing financial ruin at the hands of others, rejection and heartbreak, putting endless effort into a project only to be left crushed when it fails. Every single one of us forms our own unique identity, the story of you. Fate leads the willing and drags along the reluctant. Life moves on a linear line, like a movie. You can choose to be an actor or choose to be the director. Allowing those conquerors, bosses, politicians and CEOs to have more power over us and our own happiness than we do is to be stuck in our own victimhood. By believing other people and circumstances control how we think, feel and dictate the choices we make is to live in mental enslavement. Overcoming this mindset, freeing yourself from victimhood, can only be done by embracing a philosophy of personal responsibility for your own choices. We cannot allow ourselves to take pride in casting ourselves as the victim, only to regard others as victimizers, taking joy in our misery, wearing our misfortunes as a badge of honor, justifying our own self-pity. In reality, it allows us to wallow in our own mental shortcomings. Make the best use of what is in your power and take the rest as it happens. The world owes us nothing. Believing others are advantaged where you are disadvantaged does nothing to change your circumstances. There is no knight in shining armour coming to rescue you from your own mindset of victimhood. When we embrace the mindset of victimhood, deflecting our personal responsibility, just remember there are many politicians and bosses at the ready to exploit your false belief. It can ruin your life only if it ruins your character. Otherwise, it cannot harm you, inside or out. The beauty of it all is our ability to take a pledge for personal responsibility. That's something to be hopeful for. This should make us hopeful and those around you hopeful when witnessing being free from mental enslavement. See, we can free ourselves from victimhood by understanding the responsibility in our own choices. Where you work, what you buy, what you read, what people you surround yourself with, what attitude you take towards life. Those are choices only you can make. When we start taking personal responsibility, you realise life is fun. Life is too short to take every decision so seriously. Work with what you can control. He who laughs at himself never runs out of things to laugh at.
I wanted to talk about, one of the great contradictions of the founding of America, one of the real tragedy, a real sad story, and that is slavery. There's a whole group of people, whole class of people, who had no rights, who were slaves. Slavery is the exact opposite of rights, right? Your life, in a sense, belonged to somebody else. You're owned as a human being. It was wrong. It was a violation of the principle that they articulated. And for that contradiction, for that violation, for that evil of allowing slavery to continue, we had a civil war. 600,000 Americans died in that war. 600,000. We were a small country back then. 600,000 was even more than it would be today. Imagine 600,000 dying today in a war. And this is when we were a fraction of the size we are today. And that's because of this compromise. Because they did not take this idea of equality, of rights, of liberty, consistently, did not cover everybody. But I'll say this in their defense. It is by articulating the case for rights, for individual rights, not group rights, not collective rights. There are no such things. Individual rights. It is because they articulated that case. It's because they created a country based on that and proved the efficacy of that, the viability of that idea, that ultimately slavery was eradicated. Without the Founding Fathers, without the 4th of July, without the creation of this country, I don't think slavery would have ever been eradicated from the face of it. It's not completely eradicated. There's still cultures, particularly in the Middle East, that still have slavery. But from the Western world, it was eradicated because of the ideas articulated by the Founding Fathers. Now, ideas, granted, that they got from other Enlightenment thinkers, but they put it into reality. They manifest those ideas in a country. And within a few years after the founding of America, maybe 20 years, in Britain, they banned slavery, and then they banned the trade in slavery, and the British fleet went out there to stop slave ships from running. And the tide has shifted. And slowly, slavery was eradicated. So by the late 19th century, at least in the Western world, slavery was gone as a phenomena. A phenomena that had existed from the beginning of time. We've always had slaves. The Bible tells the Jews how to treat their slaves. There's no banning of slavery in the Bible. It's a modern idea. It's an idea of the Enlightenment. It's an idea that comes out of the ideas of the founders, the idea of unalienable rights that human beings have. And human beings doesn't distinguish between color. It doesn't distinguish between race. It doesn't distinguish between sex. Ultimately, it's the Declaration of Independence. It's the founding of this country that led to the emancipation of women. Because the fact is that the Declaration applies to all human beings. Women are human beings. So it has to apply to them. So the that contradiction ultimately was done away with. These ideas at the heart of the Declaration, at the heart of the 4th of July, at the heart of the founding of America, are unbelievably powerful ideas, the most powerful political ideas in human history, based on a lengthy philosophical tradition of the Enlightenment.
But John Henry Falk may have experienced the most profound effect. He was a graduate student when he interviewed the former slaves, including the 2 women you hear in this broadcast. Himself interviewed just before he died in 1979, Falk was going on about how he believed in giving blacks the right to go to school, giving them the right to vote, giving them the right to go into anything they qualified for. And then he said he experienced an epiphany.
I was sitting out on a wagon tongue with this old black man, and was telling him what a different kind of white man I was. I remember him looking at me very sadly and kind of sweetly and condescending and said, "You know, you still got the disease, honey. I know you think you're cured, but you're not cured. You can't give me the right to be a human being. I'm born with that right. Now, you can keep me from having that. If you've got all the policemen and all the jobs on your side, you can deprive me of it. But you can't give it to me, because I was born with it just like you was." My God, it had a profound effect on me. I was furious with him. But the more I reflected on it, the more profoundly it affected me. And I realized this was where it really was.
We didn't know nothing. Didn't like to look in no book.
Control of the slave and his labor through laws and regulations became paramount. Fountain Hughes talks about one of those controls, the pass system.
Now, I couldn't go from here across the street, or I couldn't go to nobody's house without I have a note or something from my master. And if I had that pass, that was what we call a pass. If I had that pass, I could go wherever he sent me, and I'd have to be back. Whoever he sent me to, they'd give me another pass, and I'd bring that back, so to show how long.
Even emancipation didn't truly free the slaves.
Turn us out just like, you turn out cattle.
In the narratives, the slaves used an interesting phrase for the end of slavery. They say, when the break came. Good times, easy times were not at hand.
Slavery is 2 things. Slavery is a system of domination based upon violence. Slavery ultimately is death for many millions of people. And of course, the violence which is rained upon them is hideous and obscene in the vilest sort of way. And that's one thing we have to say about slavery, and we can never forget about slavery.
A devastating reality of these slaves was that slavery was for life, and all of the children born to slaves were automatically slaves for life too. In the 16, 17, and 1800s, African Americans who lived in the United States were not seen as equals to other humans who were white. Slaves were considered property, and because of that, they were not seen as normal human beings, and basic human rights were not respected. Since slaves were considered property in the culture, different slave owners treated their property in different ways. Not all slaves were physically abused, even though many of them were. Like all property today, some people take care of what they own, and some people take advantage and abuse what they own. However, no matter how nicely a white master or his family treated the slaves living on their plantation or farm, these people would never have their freedom, and this was a very bad thing. You might be thinking to yourself, if slavery was so bad as we know today, why did people back then have slaves? And the fact of the matter was because slaves offered farmers economic success through having cheap labor to work their crops. This source of cheap labor was the main motivating factor. Working conditions were hard. Their living quarters were often very poor. Every now and then, slave owners would free their slaves, but this was rare and was never guaranteed. There were many bad things about slavery. These people were being kidnapped from their homes in Africa. They were being shipped across the ocean without their consent. They were being sold as property like cattle or sheep and not treated with dignity like people. Slaves in the United States had to work without pay for life. They had no chance for becoming free or earning a living for themselves that would get them a better life. Families were often separated from one another. Physical abuse abounded, and the psychological abuse was torture, living every day not knowing how you were going to be treated by those you worked for and having no hope of ever having a future apart from the slave life. Slavery also destroyed the African culture that many had brought with them from their homeland. Even though African Americans had a culture of their own through music and stories, much of it was blended with the culture of the colonies and the South, and many of the old African traditions were lost as a result. Not all people in the United States believed that slavery was right. In fact, many people believed that it was wrong and that it should end in the United States. These people were called abolitionists, and the movement to get rid of slavery was called abolition. Some abolitionists were brave and spoke out about what they believed. Draw a picture of an abolitionist speaking out about slavery next to your notes. They held meetings, wrote newspapers, and shared ideas to convince others that slavery was wrong and to join their cause. Abolitionists wanted plans to be put in place to remove slavery from our country. Abolitionists had three major beliefs. 1, slavery was morally wrong. 2, slavery was cruel and inhumane. And 3, slavery was a violation of the principles of democracy, which means that all men, no matter the color of their skin, were created equal. What is interesting to note is that the slavery grievance or complaint did not make it into the Declaration of Independence in 1776, but the document did say that all men are created equal, like we have learned. 11 years later, in 1787, the founders at the Constitutional Convention drafted the Constitution, and they did not eliminate slavery at that time.
Mr. Jones owned a cotton plantation and many slaves. One day he was talking to the owner of the plantation next to his, and Mr. Jones was lamenting the fact that times were tough. He was having to work his slaves harder than ever and was having trouble with some of them being disobedient or trying to run away. The other plantation owner said he knew someone who could help.
Day 1.
One day Mr. Jones called his slaves together so a man named Mr. Smith could talk to them. Before beginning, Mr. Smith whispered to Mr. Jones, "Whatever I say, do not contradict me or interfere, and I promise you your slave troubles will end." "My name is Mr. Smith," he said to the slaves, "and this may be the happiest day of your lives. From today forward, you will no longer be slaves, but free men." Mr. Jones was so shocked he started to step forward, but Mr. Smith gestured for him to remain silent. He did, only because the other plantation owner had spoken so highly of Mr. Smith's skills. "You are no longer the property of Mr. Jones," Mr. Smith continued. "You are free. No more would you be forced to labor for the benefit of Mr. Jones. Now you can work for yourselves." Now the slaves were all murmuring and looking at each other. Many were smiling, many were looking puzzled. "In fact, you are now free to leave the plantation whenever you want," Mr. Smith said. "However, since we are surrounded by other plantations, if you leave, some other plantation owner will likely claim you as his own the moment you set foot on his property. So I urge you not to risk your newfound freedom by doing something so foolish. Instead, I suggest that you stay here, no longer as slaves, but as willing participants and part owners of this plantation. Yes, this is now your plantation." Mr. Jones bit his tongue to keep from objecting. "For now, we might as well leave Mr. Jones in charge," said Mr. Smith, "since he's the only one with any experience at running a plantation, which is quite a complicated thing to manage. But he will no longer be your master, but just another worker on the plantation. In fact, he will now be using his organizational and management skills to serve you. Whatever problems you may have had with him before, you are now all equals, and you need each other to make this work. If we all cooperate and work together, we can all reap the benefits together. In honor of this happy occasion, I present you this new symbol of togetherness and cooperation, this flag, which shall be the emblem of the new, free Jones plantation." He held up the new flag, but most of those listening were still too amazed to respond. "And this shall be our motto," Mr. Smith announced. "We work together as free men for our mutual benefit, pledging our allegiance to the Jones plantation, which stands for prosperity, liberty, and justice for all. To celebrate, everyone has the rest of the day off. Enjoy your freedom, do as you please, and be back here tomorrow morning, bright and early, so that we may begin work on this great and noble new endeavor as equal free men." Finally convinced that Mr. Smith was serious, the former slaves applauded and cheered.
Day 2.
We all want this plantation to do well, Mr. Smith said at the beginning of the next meeting, so we can all share in the benefits. We all know that it takes a lot of effort to make a cotton plantation work. Just because you're all free doesn't mean you can stop working. In fact, since you're now working for yourselves, I expect you to work even harder than ever before, but now with pride and joy, knowing that you're working for yourselves. Of course, there still have to be rules. If everyone just does whatever he wants, the plantation won't produce anything. This experiment will fail, and we'll all starve. You should be thankful that Mr. Jones has agreed to stay on to lend his knowledge and skills to this endeavor, and I trust you will all do your own part to make this work. Several of you have been chosen to act as project supervisors to manage different aspects of the operation, to make sure everyone is doing his assigned job, to make sure that the rules are followed, and so on. The rest of you may head out to the fields to start your first day of work as free men.
Day 3.
The next morning, Mr. Smith had a grim expression on his face as the daily meeting began. I have an unpleasant duty to do today, he said. Yesterday, Charles was caught keeping some of the cotton he picked, presumably to sell for his own personal profit. That is against the rules. That is stealing. For that, Charles must be punished. 2 men tied Charles to the whipping post. I take no joy in this, Mr. Smith continued, but you must understand, if we do not maintain order, if we do not have rules that we all abide by, then the plantation will fail, and we will all suffer. The whip cracked against Charles' back. But if we all pitch in for the common good, then we can all prosper. Being free doesn't mean you should be selfish and greedy. We must each do our assigned duties and obey the rules, and then we can all benefit, and each of you will receive your appropriate share of the profits. A young man named Samuel stepped forward. But if you and Mr. Jones decide the rules and whip us if we disobey, how is that any different from what we had before? How can you say that? Mr. Smith asked. I'm shocked. You were a slave before, and now you're free. Things still need to be managed and organized by those best qualified to do so. Do you know how to run a plantation, Samuel? Well, no, he answered. But if we're free, why do we get no say in what the rules are and how things work? I'm surprised at your ingratitude, Mr. Smith answered. None of you know how a plantation is run, so you're in no position to be making decisions about how things are done here. You don't seem to appreciate all the things that Mr. Jones provides for you, from protecting you from all the outside threats that you know nothing about, those who would come here, capture and enslave you, if not for Mr. Jones' protection, to making sure that you all have food and housing, tools to work with, that you're cared for when sick and injured, and so on. There wouldn't be a plantation at all, no cotton to pick, no land to plant and harvest, if not for him. You should be grateful that he's made possible the level of comfort you now have. Your lives would be far worse if not for him. Nevertheless, as free and equal participants in this endeavor, from now on at each meeting, any worker may have 2 minutes to ask questions or voice suggestions or complaints. With that, the workers all seemed satisfied and headed out again to the fields to pick the cotton.
Day 4.
I have a big announcement, Mr. Smith said as the daily meeting began. Mr. Jones' cousin is here, and not just to visit and see how our project is coming along. It has been decided that from now on, you will be deciding who will manage the plantation. Of course, this job can't be done by just anyone, but every 3 months we will have a special meeting at which all the workers will vote on whether we think Mr. Jones should run the plantation or whether we think his cousin, Mr. Johnson, should run the plantation. That means that ultimately you are in charge because you will be deciding which man you want running things on your behalf. If you don't like the way things are being managed, you now have the power to change it. Amazed and pleased, the workers headed out again to the fields to pick the cotton. Days passed, months passed, a year passed, and the plantation continued to operate as before. Sometimes Mr. Jones was in charge, sometimes Mr. Johnson was in charge, but the day-to-day routine stayed exactly the same. The workers worked hard, long hours every day, and still had little to show for it. Every day the meeting would begin with them all reciting the Jones Plantation motto, "We work together as free men for our mutual benefit, pledging our allegiance to the Jones Plantation, which stands for prosperity, liberty, and justice for all." One day Mr. Smith announced, "Samuel is asked to say a few words this morning, and whatever the rest of us may think of his ideas and opinions, we are all free here, and that means we are all allowed to speak our minds. So, Samuel, you have 2 minutes. Begin." Samuel stepped forward, looking scared. "I was excited when all this started," he began, glancing nervously at Mr. Smith and Mr. Jones. "But don't you all see what's happened here? Nothing has changed. We're all still slaves." There were grumbles of disagreement from the crowd. "They tell us what to do and whip us if we don't. They still make all the rules and punish us if we disobey. They let us make suggestions and complain about things, but they never really change anything. They let us choose between Mr. Jones and Mr. Johnson, but what's the difference? The situation stays the same. We do all of the work and they take as much as they want and decide how much they'll let us keep. They live in luxury, made rich by the cotton we pick. We do all the work and have to build our own huts, grow our own food, and take care of ourselves. They leave us just enough that we don't revolt or run away. This is not freedom. We're all still slaves. They've only changed the words they use, but nothing else has changed. They say we're all free and equal, but we're not. They command and we obey. That's not freedom. That's not equality. They say we're free to leave, but all that means is that we're free to be someone else's slave. Why should we work or obey the rules? We didn't agree to this. They made the system. They forced it on us. They control and rob us and call it freedom. They've deceived you into thinking that being able to choose which slave master you'll work for is the same as being free. It's not. Open your eyes. If you keep what you produce, they call it stealing. When they take what you produce, they call it sharing and fair distribution. Can't you see that this is all? Your time is up, Samuel, Mr. Smith announced calmly. At his gesture, two supervisors grabbed Samuel by the arms and led him to the whipping post. "I'm sorry, Samuel, but you've broken the rules. There are rules against encouraging others not to work and encouraging others to break the rules. You're only hurting all of us with your discontentment and your complaining and your disobedience." The whip fell and Samuel let out a grunt. "Without rules, without order, all would be lost. Without law, there would be chaos. We can't just behave as wild animals, each doing whatever he pleases. We must all follow the plan and all do our duty for the betterment of everyone. And those who do not must be punished." The whip fell again and blood flowed freely from Samuel's back. "Samuel, it is you who are stealing from the others. When you don't do your assigned work, you are making more work for others. When you disobey the rules, it is you who are endangering the future of everyone else here. You are the thief. You are the criminal. You are the one trying to destroy the arrangement that keeps us all safe and prosperous." At every lash of the whip, the other workers cheered louder and louder, some yelling curses at Samuel. "Being spoiled and selfish, you complain about everything, talking as if you're oppressed. But you are the one ruining things. You are the one keeping us from being all we could be. It is your greed and your rebelliousness that is hurting all of us. They all play by the rules," Mr. Smith said, gesturing at the others. "What makes you think that you don't have to? You think you're above the law?" There were loud yells of agreement as the whip fell again. "We must maintain order," Mr. Smith proclaimed, "to make this plantation great, to make it so that we can all be happy and prosperous. To have the society we want, there have to be rules. We all have to contribute our fair share to this great endeavor, and we cannot tolerate actions and attitudes that seek to undermine the amazing things that together as free men we have achieved and will continue to achieve." Mr. Jones was smiling as he gave Mr. Smith a pat on the back. The crowd was cheering so loudly that none of them had noticed that Samuel had died.
Well, sure, you can say that slavery is bad and all, and that people shouldn't be forcibly robbed of the fruits of their labors, and I don't necessarily disagree, but I mean, we can't just do away with it with nothing to replace it. We have to gradually transition from slavery to no slavery. And I wouldn't even go for that unless and until you can describe for me just how every aspect of society will work without slavery. You can't just say it's wrong and suddenly end it. I mean, who will pick the cotton? You have to ease into these things. Maybe we can start by petitioning slave owners to allow their slaves to have more free time, and maybe ask them to not whip the slave so hard or so often. But we can't be extreme. We can't just say it's bad, so end it right now. Think of the chaos that would ensue if tomorrow there was suddenly no slavery. You know, just because some slave masters are really nasty, yeah, I guess it's pretty much all of them, but that still doesn't mean that slavery in and of itself is inherently bad. Yeah, we definitely need rules limiting how nasty the slave owners can be to their slaves, but that doesn't mean that the institution has to be done away with entirely. I mean, no slavery? Come on, that's kooky and extreme. It's utopian. I mean, just think of slavery as a necessary evil. Well, sure, you can say that government is bad and all, and that people shouldn't be forcibly robbed of the fruits of their labors, and I don't necessarily disagree, but I mean, we can't just do away with it with nothing to replace it. We have to gradually transition from government to no government. And I wouldn't even go for that unless and until you can describe for me just how every aspect of society will work without government. You can't just say it's wrong and suddenly end it. I mean, who will build the roads? You have to ease into these things. Maybe we can start by petitioning Congress to reduce or eliminate certain taxes and to repeal unjust laws. But we can't be extreme. We can't just say it's bad, so end it right now. Think of the chaos that would ensue if tomorrow there was suddenly no government. You know, just because some governments are really nasty, yeah, I guess it's pretty much all of them, but that still doesn't mean that government in and of itself is inherently bad. Yeah, we definitely need rules limiting how nasty the governments can be to the people. But that doesn't mean that the institution has to be done away with entirely. I mean, no government? Come on, that's kooky and extreme. It's utopian. I mean, just think of government as a necessary evil.
Kaylee.
Yes.
You were born April 4th, 1999. Do you believe you were created to be free, or do you believe you were created to be a slave?
I believe I was created to be free.
Okay? Once again, that's what 100% of participants surveyed answer. But I know it's not the reality of their lives. And I know they're never going to be happy unless they create calibration and commitment to the fact that they were born created to be free. And encourage the people that you love to do the same exact thing. And once again, form a plan as to how you're going to cast off the shackles of your own slavery. Because unless you're willing to cast off those shackles from your false happiness activities, from your slavery activities, you're never going to go through this life being as happy as you can.
The public relations industry, the advertising industry, which is dedicated to creating consumers, it's a phenomenon that developed in the freest countries, in Britain and the United States. And the reason is pretty clear. It became clear by, say, a century ago that it was not going to be so easy to control the population by force. Too much freedom had been won. Labor organizing, parliamentary labor parties in many countries, women started to get the franchise and so on. So you had to have other means of controlling people. And it was understood and expressed that you have to control them by control of beliefs and attitudes. Well, one of the best ways to control people in terms of attitudes is what the great political economist Thorstein Veblen called fabricating consumers. If you can fabricate once, make obtaining things that are just about within your reach the essence of life, they're going to be trapped into becoming consumers. And it's done with great sophistication.
You don't see many wild stallions anymore. He's one of the last of a wild and very singular breed. Come to Marlboro country.
The ideal is what you actually see today, where, let's say, teenage girls, if they have a free Saturday afternoon, will go walking in the shopping mall, not to the library or somewhere else. The idea is to try to control everyone, to turn the whole society into the perfect system. Perfect system would be a society based on a dyad, a pair. The pair is you and your television set, or maybe now you and the internet, in which that presents you with what the proper life would be, what kind of gadgets you should have. And you spend your time and effort gaining those things which you don't need and you don't want, and maybe you'll throw them away. But that's the measure of a decent life. What we see is in, say, advertising on television. If you've ever taken an economics course, you know that markets are supposed to be based on informed consumers making rational choices. Well, if we had a system like that, a market system, then a television ad would consist of, say, General Motors putting up information saying, here's what we have for sale. That's not what an ad for a car is. An ad for a car is a football hero, an actress, the car doing some crazy thing like going up a mountain or something. The point is to create uninformed consumers who will make irrational choices. That's what advertising is all about. And when the same institutions, PR system, runs elections, they do it the same way. They want to create an uninformed electorate which will make irrational choices, often against their own interests. And we see it every time one of these extravaganzas take place.
An anonymous quote, I believe this was from some internet forum. I don't know what the gentleman's name was, but it was a great quote. Ignorance is the root cause of all evil. And since only knowledge eradicates ignorance, it is our duty and moral obligation, there's that term, to educate ourselves as well as the masses around us. That's a moral obligation if you're in a position of knowledge. And once again, that's why I do what I do. I don't do it because I like people. Believe me, Barb will tell you how much I like people. I don't do it to make friends. I don't do it to make money. I do it because it's a moral obligation and for no other reason. I don't serve people. I serve truth. Truth is the force which I serve. And I bend the knee to no other. That's it. That's it. So great quote on ignorance there. Great few quotes on ignorance. Let's look at the next expression. The internal expression is what happens inside of us, very simply. So now we've started creating with a polarity. Something has happened in the world, either acceptance of truth or refusal of truth. Now something's going to take place inside of us, right? So look, this level is that knowledge level, right? This is the base consciousness level. You could look at, that's the foundation. Remember that 4-block diagram, right? You could look at this, here's the foundation. This is the foundation that lies underneath the trivium, right? Okay? That's as deep as it gets. Consciousness or unconsciousness, love or fear. That's what everything is a choice about, between, right? Now here's that first block. Knowledge or lack thereof. Knowledge or ignorance, right? And you can see these polarities are like that concept of, the polarity aspect of the natural law principles, okay? There's one thing that's real, and then this is the illusion. Okay? These are two aspects of the same thing. This is consciousness, and this is its lack. This is acceptance of truth, and this is the lack of that. Okay? So it's the same thing, but opposite in degree, which is why they're the same expression. Now, what happened after knowledge or lack thereof? We went up to understanding, right? So that's what this level is. Understanding happens internally, right? It's an internal process, all right? So the positive aspect of the internal expression is when we come to understand through developing the knowledge and the acceptance of truth that we are sovereign. Sovereignty is the expression, the internal positive expression of natural law. Now, again, underneath these, in parentheses, I always put what I call these things, another name that I've given to these things, these concepts. I call sovereignty internal monarchy. Internal monarchy. Now, monarchy means one ruler. Mon means one, is a prefix for one, and archon in Greek means ruler or master. So, internally, we each need to master and rule ourselves. This is our kingdom that we get to rule and nowhere else. We don't get to rule over anybody else. Many people think they're the rulers of other people, but they're wrong. Each of us is a sovereign being. Sovereignty, as we're going to see, means that you're not owned by anyone else. No one else owns you if you're sovereign. Okay? So here's my expression, my visualization for sovereignty. Okay? Somebody who truly has the light. They have the light at their disposal. They're bathed in it. It's flowing within them. Okay? And light has always been associated in different mystery traditions as knowledge. It's been a symbol that has represented knowledge. This is the person who has the knowledge and has gone through the decision making and filtering processes with that knowledge to come to an internal understanding that they are a sovereign being. And I have news for everybody, whether you know it or not, whether you are familiar with the term or not, every person here is a sovereign, and you can never not be. It is an impossibility for you ever to be non-sovereign. It cannot be done. Cannot be done in nature. Okay? Every single human being on this planet is a sovereign being. And we're going to look at what a sovereignty actually means. The positive aspect of the internal expression is sovereignty, or what I call internal monarchy, meaning one ruler within. Internal monarchy, one ruler within. As a state of consciousness, sovereignty means that one has unified the three aspects of their consciousness, such that there is no internal contradiction between one's thoughts, emotions, and actions. We become a being that as we think, so we feel, so we speak and act. And there's no contradiction between those. We're not torn apart from within in this state of internal opposition amongst our own consciousness. Okay? Moreover, let's break the word sovereign down. That's where we're going to come to the real meaning of the term. Sovereign is derived from the Latin adverb super. Super means above. See, in classical Latin, there's no V in classical Latin, right? There was no V character. Actually, if you wrote a V like that, it was a U, okay? And why a double U looks the way that it is. It's two V's, actually. But that sound was U in Latin, if you see a V. There's no V sound in classical Latin. It doesn't exist phonetically, all right? So this phonetic variation that we express as V or V in English, in Latin was P or B. It was represented by a P or a B. So what we're really seeing here is suver, okay? But it was pronounced in Latin super, like super. Well, what does super mean? Super, you're beyond, you're above and beyond. Okay? It means above or beyond. That's what it means. A superman is one who's beyond an ordinary man, right? The Latin noun regnum comprises the second part of the etymological root of this word. Regnum, it comes from rex regis in Latin, or regis. It means king. So regnum was the king's rulership. Regnum means his reign. It's where the word reign comes from in English, regnum, in Latin. It means rulership or externally imposed control. Okay? Not control in the context, I'm going to control my emotions, I'm going to control my behavior. No. It means I'm going to control you externally by imposing my will over your will through coercion. That's the context of rulership or control that I'm talking about here. So put them together. Super regnum, sovereign, means above or beyond externally imposed rulership or control by another. That's what it means. Sovereign means not a subject to another being, like a king, like one who considers himself a king. And it means not a slave to someone who considers themselves your master. That's all sovereign means, folks. Not a slave. And why I say every single person here is a sovereign is because there is no such thing, never has been any such thing, and never will be any such thing as legitimacy to slavery. That has never existed, does not exist now, and never will exist. Slavery is an illegitimate concept. None of us are slaves. The condition of slavery has been imposed upon people, but it has never in history been legitimate, and it never will in history be legitimate. So there is no legitimacy to the concept of slavery, of the rightful rulership of another being through directly imposing your control through coercion. Doesn't exist. That's a big part of what natural law is about. We have to understand when we're saying this word, this is what is meant by sovereign, not a slave. Okay, we did a study where we asked people, are you a sovereign? Like 11% said yes. Maybe. I think it was 10 or 11%. Which I thought was almost encouraging, that 1 in 10 people knew that they were sovereign beings. It was amazing. But 90% of the human population doesn't feel that they're sovereign, doesn't know that they're sovereign. I'm telling you, it doesn't matter an iota whether you believe you are or not. I'm telling you it's an eternal truth that you are a sovereign and can never be non-sovereign. There is no such thing as someone else's legitimate rulership or ownership of you. Because there's no such thing to the legitimacy of slavery, and there never has been, and there never will be. So everyone is a sovereign. A sovereign is a monarch. Again, mon means one, and archon means ruler. So when people ask me, what kind of government do you want? I tell them I want anarchy, and I want monarchy. And they're like, how could you have those things simultaneously? Because if you have internal monarchy, you can have external anarchy. See, we need to have the rulership within, and we need to get rid of the rulership without. This is the kingdom we need to master, and we need to set aside the concept of mastery and slavery in the external domain, in the physical world. Sovereignty, a sovereign is a monarch, which means a single ruler who rules only the kingdom of self. Sovereignty is a state in which one controls one's own thoughts, emotions, and actions, and by bringing them into unity or non-contradiction or non-duality, attains mastery over one's own consciousness. Sovereignty could be considered the equivalent of true self-control, true self-mastery, true self-love, or true self-ownership. It's all of these things. And ultimately, it means not a slave. That's what has to be remembered above all else. There is equality under natural law, perfect equality. Everyone has the exact same rights. No one has any more or less rights than anyone else. Also, since rights are not created by humanity, and since they are the birthright of humanity, gifted to us by the creator of the universe, no human being or group of human beings is actually capable, in reality, of granting rights to anyone else, nor is any human being capable of revoking rights from anyone else. Everybody has the same rights. No one can make up a new right. No one can grant a right to somebody that is actually a wrong. Does not exist, never has existed, never will exist. This is an illusory belief system. All right? I'm not telling you people don't believe that can be done. I'm telling you in reality, in truth, it can never be done. Chris Leispooner phrased it pretty well. He said, government is nothing but men acting in concert. The morality and value of government, like any other association of men, will be no greater and no less than the morality and value of the men comprising it. Since government is nothing but men, its inherent, quote, authority to act is in no way greater or different than the, quote, authority to act of any individuals in isolation, like that example of two people on the planet. Government has no magic powers or, quote, authority that is not possessed by private individuals. Let he who asserts that government may do that which the individual may not do assume the onus of proof. That means the burden of proof, and demonstrate his contention. And you know what? There's nobody on this planet that can do that. Because when it comes down to it, if you're telling somebody else they may either commit a wrong against somebody else or prevent someone else from exercising a right, that's a lie. And that does not exist. Not in reality. It exists in a diseased mind is where it exists. Only in a sick mind is where that belief exists. You have to be imbalanced in the mind, in the psyche, to believe that that's true. It's a mental illness. I mean, that's what it really is. The word government, you break it down. People say this word every day almost, and yet they've never looked at the etymological roots of the word. It comes from the Latin verb gubernare. Once again, no V in classical Latin. No V, okay? So again, V's were rendered as either B's or P's in classical Latin language. So you could write this in what would be more modern Latin as gubernare with a V. But in classical Latin or ancient Latin, there is no V, so it would have been rendered with a B, gubernare. Now, what's the election of a governor called? It's called a gubernatorial election. Gubernatorial. Gubernare is in there, okay? Gubernare means to control. The verb gubernare in Latin means to control. The Latin noun mens, which is where the second part of the word ment is derived from, means mind. Okay? So you put these together, and the word government actually literally, from its etymological roots, means to control the mind, or in other words, mind control. Now, I'm going to put something else up here for a moment. The etymological origin of the English suffix ment, M-E-N-T, is often debated in this etymological breakdown, all right? And I've gotten stuff about this constantly, and I've told people I'm not interested in hearing about it anymore. I know where this comes from. I know why the creators of the English language made it so, made it like this, okay? It is overwhelmingly clear by people who have studied linguistics and the origins of words, okay, in English from ancient languages, that the creators of the English language deliberately chose the Latin noun mens, meaning mind, to represent or mean in English the state of or the condition of. And this was done in direct keeping with the first principle of natural law, as we've already discussed, the principle of mentalism, which demonstrates that in order for any particular thing, event, or circumstance, any state or condition to exist in manifested reality, it, as it currently does, which is known as the plane of effects, it must have first existed in the plane of causality or the mental realm, the mind. Okay? We've already looked at that principle of natural law. So, anything that ends in ment, the original etymological derivation means that it was made that way first by a state of mind which led to its creation in physical reality. Okay? Any word you can think of that ends in M-E-N-T, meaning the state of or the condition of, means it happened in mind first, and therefore it led to the state of or the condition of in physical reality. Okay? So, when I say that government means mind control, it literally does, and that is an accurate etymological breakdown. Okay? The word mens was deliberately chosen for specific reasons. And I just explained the reason of that meaning, the state of or the condition of. And many people want to hotly contest that. I'm telling you outright, they're wrong. They don't understand why that was chosen. Mens, meaning mind, was chosen deliberately to mean the state of or the condition of. Government is based on this illusory and false concept called authority. People think certain people are authorities, that they actually have rights that other people don't have. The right to command, compel, coerce, and tell people, this is right, this is what you're going to do, and if you disagree, I have the power to actually compel, coerce, or constrain you against your will. If you're not harming anybody, even in the taking of that action. Authority is based upon an equal illusion that is called jurisdiction. Now, if we break down this word, it comes from the Latin noun. Jurisdiction comes from Latin, jus juris. Jus juris in Latin means law. Juris is the possessive case. And the Latin verb dictere. So, jus dictere, juris dictere, jurisdiction. Okay? Dictere means to say or to speak. Thus, jurisdiction literally means to say what the law is. Or in other words, we get to make up what the law is. The law is not something that exists in nature and is based upon right and wrong and truth and morality. No, we get to make it up. We're God. We get to say what's right and what's wrong. And therefore, since we make the law, we're the owners of these people. They're in our jurisdiction. You know, we own them. And we get to make up what they're allowed to do and what they're not allowed to do. Authority ultimately is an illusion, again, of a diseased mind, a diseased psyche, based entirely in violence and built upon the erroneous and dogmatic belief that some people are masters who have the moral right to issue commands and others are slaves who have a moral obligation to obey the commands of the masters. I don't care what you want to call it. You can euphemize it any way you want. I call it what it really is. Slavery. That's what it really is. Doesn't come down to anything else. You can call it whatever you want, euphemize it, try to make it sound as nice or as pleasant as possible. It's all one thing. It's called slavery. It's always immoral and it needs to be ended. That's it. And we have to develop the knowledge and the courage to end it. The knowledge, the care, and the courage to end it. The belief in the legitimacy of, quote, authority, this illusory nonsense notion, is the belief in the legitimacy of slavery. Anybody who believes in that authority is legitimate and government is legitimate, whether they want to admit it or not, or know it or not, or understand it or not, I don't care what they believe. They are advocating the legitimacy of slavery. That's not my belief. I don't care who calls that my belief. I'm just looking right into the camera and saying this. Because I know the people in this room know that that's not my belief. I'm telling anybody who's listening to this, that's not my belief. That's eternal truth. Eternal truth. Okay? You believe in these concepts, you are a supporter of slavery. The end. That's how it really is. Not because I said so. Because that's how it really is. Okay? And that's called mind control. For somebody to believe that slavery is legitimate, you gotta be under deep mind control. You gotta be either that or a sick, psychopathic, absolute piece of garbage. Okay? One of those things or another is true if you believe in those concepts. And again, I'm not afraid to tell it to somebody right to their face like that. I don't care. I'm not here to serve truth, make friends, or be liked. I'm here to tell people what the truth. I'm not here to serve human beings, make friends, or be liked. I am here to serve the truth. Whether it will be accepted is not up to me. I'm doing what I'm charged to do by creation. Okay? Whether it's accepted is somebody else's karma, not mine. Ultimately, authority is the idea that man can become God and through, quote, jurisdiction, dictate the law. What the dark occultists of this world, who are behind ostensible governments in the world, they set up all of these institutions as temples, right? What this sick psychopathic priest class ultimately believes is they're going to become God. We're going to turn natural law on top of its head, and we're going to rule in hell. That's it. We're going to rule in hell. So a statist is an individual who erroneously believes there's such a thing as authority that is vested in certain human beings, magically giving them the right to rule over other people. This authority means that certain people who we call government have the, quote, moral right to issue commands to those whom they rule, those under their jurisdiction, and that their subjects or slaves have a, quote, moral obligation to obey the arbitrary dictates or laws, quote unquote, that are set by their masters. Most simply put, a statist is nothing more than someone who believes in the legitimacy of slavery. From the Greek prefix an, which means without or the absence of, and the Greek noun archon, they're written in Greek script, which means master or ruler. And again, I mean externally. One who externally rules another or claims to be the master of another. That's what the term archon means in its connotation. Anarchy, as we can see by putting these together, does not mean without rules. The word archon does not mean rules. Okay? Because there's always going to be rules in effect called natural law, the laws of morality. It means rulers, imposed rulers. That's what archon means in Greek. It literally means anarchy now, putting it together. An, absence of, archon, master or ruler. The absence of masters or rulers. Externally imposed masters or rulers. Meaning, when we put it together, okay, it means without rulers, without masters. Now, if you give people that term, no masters, no rulers, no masters, no slaves, what word are they going to associate those phrases with? Freedom. But if you tell people what does anarchy mean to you, what do you associate it with, what are they going to tell you? Chaos, which is the exact opposite. That's in that other column. Okay? They have deliberately obfuscated the meaning of the word through a mind control technique called endless repetition. If I could keep telling you a word doesn't mean what it means, that's not a projector, that's a hammer. Hey, could you check out my hammer over there and make sure it's projecting the image on the board correctly? You know, the bulb burned out in my hammer. I might need to go buy a new hammer. If I kept doing that endlessly for years and years and years, people would start calling that device a hammer. If I got enough people to keep calling it that. So they've gotten enough people to call freedom chaos. Think about that. They've gotten enough people to believe that the absence of the state of slavery means chaos instead of freedom. It's almost unfathomable. It's almost incomprehensible. The mind job that's been done on this species. It's almost incomprehensible. Anarchy is the state of existence where there are no masters and no slaves. Therefore, what it really means is the absence of slavery, or in other words, true freedom. That's all it means. I prefer to call it anarchony, okay? Keeping the entire word archon instead of taking out the O-N, okay? If we keep that there and call it anarchony, and I say I'm an anarchonist, people will ask, well, what the hell is that? And then you could really break the word down and say the absence of archons, the absence of those who would claim to be masters over a population of slaves. That's what an anarchonist is. It's saying that's illegitimate, that's unnecessary, and that we need to do away with that state of existence. Okay? The control and slavery system is actually about the limitation of free will through the destruction of possibility. See, all they've done, right? The old world order used to be religion and priest kings, right? We're in between you and God. We're the intercessors, the intermediaries. We make the law, you're our subjects, you're our slaves, you obey, or it's our wrath. All they've done is take the concept of a singular ruler, which was the old world order, and they've converted it into the concept of now There's a ruling class called government that gets to make up what we tell you you may or may not do, okay? And they're up here at the top of the pyramid now. That's all. They turned it from a monarchy to somewhat of an oligarchy. But it's the same concept. We're the moral masters that you have a moral obligation to obey, and you're the slave class, that has an obligation to obey our commands. That's it. Nothing changed. All they did is say, well, no, people don't no longer believe in the priest king, so we need to create an institution where this quote-unquote authority is seemingly diffused through many people. It's always been nonsense. It's always been mind control. It's not going to be anything else other than that until it goes away. Because that's the only way to envision a way out of the prison. You have to envision it first, then you have to put those thoughts and emotions that you used for that envisioning process into actual action so that it becomes manifested in the physical world. Through their fear of the possibility of chaos, which is actually the fear of true freedom, most people advocate the legitimacy and continuance of authority in government and are therefore actually advocating the legitimacy and continuance of violence and slavery. Those who believe that authority is necessary and that it must continue because of this fear of chaos have actually been duped into believing that human slavery is necessary. And get this, folks, human slavery must therefore continue in order to prevent chaos. Now imagine that. Imagine that. That's what statism is, though. That's what the religion called the belief in government or statism is. It is the belief that human slavery is necessary and must continue indefinitely in order to prevent chaos from manifesting. Now, tell me how that could possibly work. Can violence and slavery, which is actually what government is a euphemism for, statism and government are just euphemisms for violence and slavery. Okay? Can violence and slavery ever possibly prevent chaos? Why? What? Why can't it? Because they are chaos. Violence and slavery are chaos. We are already in the state of chaos. Being held under the threat of violence and duress, which is slavery, is the state of chaos. So forget about fearing chaos coming on. You're in it now. Surprise, surprise. Hate to break the news to you all. Okay? We're already in the state of chaos. We need to create real order by getting rid of violence and slavery. The true great work can only be performed after one has already realized the truth regarding natural law and brought oneself, one's own actions into alignment with natural law. That's when it begins. Because once you do that and you're no longer in that internal contradiction or opposition, that's when you can legitimately start teaching it to other people because you know it deeply enough and you've actually aligned your behavior to it. So the true great work is what comes after that. And here's what it is. This is actually what the true great work is now. It is the arduous task of influencing other people to go through the very same process of change, of positive change in consciousness that you have gone through. It is to help them to realize that in supporting and condoning the legitimacy of authority and government, in other words, man's law, that what they have actually been supporting and condoning is the legitimacy of slavery, and that they were immoral for having done so. Now that is hard work. Because people don't want to hear this. They want to believe what they want to believe. They want to be true what they want to be true. They filter their perceptions through those lenses.
So I am Etienne de la Boissy Squared, and I'm the author of Understanding Our Slavery, where I'm trying to explain how intergenerational organized crime controls the government and the media, And I do that in a very image-rich, historical photos, infographic book that has everything from media charts to examples of how the media is controlled, and also the techniques used by intergenerational organized crime to control society. And I take a look at 4 different societies. I take a look at Nazi Germany, the US, the Soviet Union, and East Germany, and I show what those look like in each time and place so that people can see the historical pattern. And then human beings are very good pattern recognition machines. And so when you see that, hey, they're all using mandatory government schools, they all have a social contract that nobody signed, they all have a youth program where the kids get awards for how to be a citizenship, and then the youth program gets militarized, and they all use torture, and they all run secret prisons, and they all use lie to start wars. You know, after about 20 of those, you're like, hey, wait a minute, that's a playbook. And our government's using the same techniques as the Nazis and the Soviets, and the fact that you can actually see the pattern yourself, that generally like wakes people up to, hey, wait a minute, that's artificial, and I understand the game.
I'll try to speed through this. All right, the unwritten story of our future. It's about understanding the abuse victim cycle and how to get out of it. Okay, when a traumatic event or abuse occurs, the abuser, the person who experiences it, either identifies with the abuser or the victim, and therefore they continue to repeat the cycle. Okay, only when we have enough knowledge, care, and willpower can we break the abuse victim cycle. And I talk about this a lot in my podcast. Go back to the ones I did on that and check it out. It's about balance between the brain such that we're not in master think or slave think. Again, in my podcast, I cover this extensively. When you're in left brain imbalance, it leads to masculine domination, the suppression of the emotion, and eventually roots us into the lower brain, the reptile brain. Okay? If you're in right brain imbalance, okay, that roots us in the mammalian brain, which means that our emotions are out of control, and we're not really stepping up with confidence, with courage, and standing up for our rights. We go into slave think mentality. Healing this divide, balancing both hemispheres of the brain by working with these different brain dynamics holistically is the way out of that imbalance. Genetics versus epigenetics. I just want to say here that I feel the power of consciousness can trump anything that has been done to us genetically. So to leave people with a little bit of hope, the answer is consciousness, and that could totally break any of the genetic programming that these beings have done to us, no matter how deep. Okay, no matter how deeply seated it is. But that's if we take the time to explore the knowledge of ourselves. If you want to look into how epigenetics can trump genetics, really look into the works of Dr. Bruce Lipton, cell biologist. His work, The Biology of Belief, is absolutely essential to that matter. Okay? Self-loathing is the underlying psychological condition that causes people to attempt to abdicate their own personal responsibility, to exercise conscience, and fall into the patterns of willful ignorance, order following, and the justification of immoral behavior. Self-loathing is created when earlier psychological trauma has been suppressed and buried into the subconscious mind, instead of being confronted, dealt with, and healed. The effects of such unresolved trauma often take the form of feelings of inadequacy and unworthiness, whether those feelings are real, suggested, or imagined. And this is the dynamic of a self-loather. I have suffered, therefore I shall cause suffering unto others. That cycle has to be broken, and this is the exact mindset, okay? I've suffered, therefore I'm going to cause suffering, that keeps people in the prison of their own making. 5 minutes, great. Self-respect, from the Latin re, meaning again, and spectare, meaning to look at, is the only thing that can ultimately heal self-loathing, and therefore help to put humanity on the path to healing and conscience. Self-respect ultimately means to take another look at oneself. Respect, to look at again, to look at the self again, to go in and understand the aspects of human consciousness. Okay? These are what I call the 3 R's: respect, remembrance, and responsibility. Respect, remembrance, and responsibility is the path out of this prison, okay? Self-respect, taking another look at the self, remembering who we really are, okay? Self-knowledge, knowledge of self. The ways that we can express our own consciousness is through thought, emotion, and action. This is the real holy trinity that exists within each one of us. It's been called the mind, body, spirit connection. The masculine and feminine aspects together with the creative aspects of the mind, the thoughts, to be unified such that we are a being that as we think, so we feel, so we act, and there's no contradiction between those three modes of consciousness. Here's the expressions, thought, emotion, and action, the fulfillments of which are the fulfillments of thoughts are knowledge, understanding, and wisdom. The fulfillments of emotion are true care, empathy, and compassion. The fulfillments of action are courage, willpower, and persistence. This is what humanity needs to develop. If we stay in the failures of thought, emotion, and action, we stay in the prison. The failures of thought are ignorance, foolishness, and naivete. The failure of emotion is apathy, indifference, and callousness. The failure of action is cowardice, laziness, and submission. Okay? That's the basic knowledge chart that we need to take into ourselves and understand how we work, because our controllers know how the human consciousness works, and they've done their best to keep that knowledge from us. We have to understand our own sovereignty. Sovereign is a word derived from Latin, the adverb super meaning above, and the noun regnum meaning rulership or control. Thus, sovereign means one who is above the rulership or control of another, or in a word, free. Sovereignty, the word sovereign simply means, ladies and gentlemen, not a slave. It doesn't mean anything else. It never has meant anything else. It means that you are the ruler of yourself and no one else rules over you externally. It means you are not a slave. Every person in the world is sovereign, whether they know it or not. Slavery is illegitimate. None of us are legitimately slaves, therefore we are all sovereigns. An individual's personal responsibility to choose right action over wrong action for themselves is always their own. One can only make the claim that they can, quote, abdicate their personal responsibility for such choice, for such decision to someone else. This can never actually be done in reality. More simply put, an individual is always responsible for their own behavior, for their own actions. We need to grow up, think for ourselves, and stop following orders. Following orders is not a virtue. It is the path to total destruction. It is the path to slavery. It should not be looked at as a virtue. Really wrapping this up, the bottom line of all of this is, regardless of how troubled our cosmic childhood may have been, humanity's childhood is over, ladies and gentlemen. Humanity's childhood is over, and a choice stands before us all. That choice is either to enter cosmic adulthood or perish. That is the choice that stands before humanity right now, and is up to each one of us to make. The path to that cosmic adulthood is the understanding of natural law and how to apply it in our lives. That is the master key which the universe has given to us. That is the pathway to freedom that can unlock all the locks on all the doors to all the cages. Okay? Natural law is the answer. Okay? And what the universe is beckoning us and calling us forth to do, ladies and gentlemen, in two words, what the universe is beckoning us and calling us forth to do on this planet is to break our chains and to end slavery. What I'm talking about here is aggregate numbers. The vast majority, the vast percentages of people are in a state of psychological self-loathing. Subconsciously. They don't have to think consciously, I really don't like myself. Most people don't have self-loathing issues at that conscious level and like want to kill themselves or say that they hate themselves. Nonetheless, they do hate themselves deep down inside. Underneath it, at the subconscious level, at the level of the unseen. Okay, and there's another reason for this self-hatred. See, again, just to clarify this, only a people who are self-loathing and ultimately hate themselves could allow themselves to remain enslaved. It follows logically. If you just think about it, it has nothing to do with the physical enslavement here. People are participating in their own enslavement because they will not desist in doing certain jobs, because they will not desist in continuing to support the financial and monetary enslavement, because they want theirs. See, they can't transition to the mindset that there's only one family living on this planet. It's too far beyond their level of consciousness to go to. They can't make that fundamental understanding to transition into the level of awareness that there is no separation at the ultimate level. And I get it. Not everybody understands that. That is the one level of actual separation, consciousness. Whether people understand that we are really one, whether people understand that there is no such thing as authority and no one is higher than anybody else. And that doesn't mean there aren't people who are at higher levels of awareness and consciousness when it comes to these truths. And I get it. That may sound like total alien language to some people listening out there because they're not there yet. They're not at that level yet. I get it. Once again, I'm not naive enough to believe everybody's at the same level of consciousness. I'm telling you what the truth is, but I'm telling you not everybody's going to accept that or understand it. They're going to look at you when you try to explain it like you have 3 heads growing out of your neck. Okay? Don't make the mistake of believing people are on the same level of awareness when it comes to the solutions, to what really needs to be done, because they're not. Most people can't even comprehend that language, let alone really understand the level of consciousness it's going to take to get there. You know, it would literally, with some people, be like trying to explain arithmetic to a dog. Literally. And I'm not saying that to insult people. I'm saying it because it's true. That's the level of consciousness they're at. So, this self-loathing condition is what has to ultimately be repaired. Now, that's not easy work. That's not going to be easy to do. Because the conditions are holding people in self-loathing as well. Not just their psychological framework or mindset. The external conditions in the world are continuing because these people don't have time to work on themselves. They're too busy doing things for survival needs, you know? Let alone, they're barely scraping by with basic survival, let alone thinking about deep nested psychological issues at the subconscious level. They're not looking at themselves. They're doing everything they can to avoid looking at themselves in many cases. So this self-loathing, only true self-respect can heal it. Breaking out of the abuse victim cycle, saying, no, I don't need to continue to think about it as I need to come out on top. I don't need to think about it as I need to do what's been done to me or what's been done to other people to propagate the same cycle of abuse. We have to get out of the abuse victim game, out of the mentality. Get out of the mentality of wanting to be an abuser and wanting to continue to be abused. That's what real self-respect is. We'll pick this up on the other side. Stay with us. What pacifism is the notion that no matter how much violence is done unto you, you will never use the defensive use of force against the one who is accosting you or the group that is accosting you and doing violence unto you. So in other words, it's saying you will never physically stand up for rights which you possess. You will allow someone to come and take them, to take rights. You will allow someone to come and take property. You will allow someone to even come and take life. And I find that one of the most deplorable ideologies that can exist on the earth or anywhere else for that matter. So,
and if I may interrupt you quickly there,
sure.
Mark, because I think that this is also an important point, is that this isn't always just physical, is it? I mean, this is also displayed in the way people just back down when authority figures come around, like, you know,
Right.
police or military or any so-called someone in a position of authority. They come along and they start ordering you around and getting you to become subservient to them.
Right.
And we see the same mentality displayed there. So they're not even going to defend themselves physically, of course, but not even psychologically or verbally to stand up and say and speak their mind and to say, no, I'm going to say no to this. I don't agree with it. Here's my line in the sand. So we see this displayed all across the board here.
See, it would be even more accurate, David, to call this passivism. P-A-S-S-I-V-I-S-M, passivism. You know, you notice that that's a word play there that fits perfectly with what pacifism, supposedly based on the Latin, obviously, the etymology of the word pacifism based on the Latin word for peace, pax, P-A-X. But really,
it's so telling that when we're saying the word pacifism, we're saying the word passivism. Okay, it's being passive and laying down when aggression is being done unto you. And you could even see it in other ways of being passive. It doesn't even have to be with the so-called authority figures. The New Agers are passive even in people that they encounter in life that, that they don't want to get up in their face about their wrong behavior, about their aggressive or violent behavior. They want to just say, oh, they'll learn it in their time, or that's not for them to understand now, or they've made a choice not to be awake now or not to hear this now. Well, what if the real case is they're not learning this because no one's challenging them on their horrific behavior, on their horrible behavior? No one's getting up in their face. Too many people are being too passive and not challenging people on these behaviors that are completely immoral. I like the word passivism even more than pacifism. So you have the non-aggression principle we saw earlier. That simply means do not initiate undue and unrightful usage of initiation of force against your fellow beings. That's it. Don't start any coercive action toward another person. Once you're doing that, you've stepped into the realm of aggression, and that's not a right. That's a wrongdoing. And you combine the negation of aggression, or the non-aggression principle. If my rights, my property, my life are accosted by violence, I am not going to passively stand there and just allow that act of aggression to go uninhibited, to go unresponded, not respond to it, to just allow it to be done with complete impunity. No. You're going to use whatever defensive use of force is required to put down that act of aggression. And I would include up to and including deadly force if it's necessary, depending on the type of aggression that is used against you. So, and I say that is an absolute human right. It is an absolute human right that is not gifted to humanity by man and can never be taken away from humanity by man. And this is what so many governments and people in government and people in many religions and people in the New Age movement and a lot of your average people on the street simply do not recognize that is a natural, inherent human right to defend oneself. And now when you go into that deeper, you understand that since certain types of weaponry exist, that nobody can say to someone else, you may not defend yourself with a particular type of weapon. That is someone's decision to make for themselves, depending on how they want to defend themselves. It would be the equivalent of trying to take away, for example, an automatic or semi-automatic weapon, a battle rifle, from someone in the modern day. Okay, would be the equivalent of attempting to disarm someone with a stone in perhaps 100,000 years ago or more, or to take away the ability for someone to defend themselves with a dagger or a sword or a slingshot, 1,000 years ago or 500 years ago. In today's world, this is the most modern personal weaponry that is available with technology that we have. And you could get into all of the arguments about whether, wouldn't it be a beautiful world for things like that not to exist and for people not to ever use anything like that to do harm to someone else. That's a moot point because they do exist. And for someone to say you may not have a particular weapon is slavery. If you were to go back in medieval times and say you may not possess a sword, you're doing that, you're disarming that person because you're saying you are a particular class of people that is to be controlled. You may not have the ability to ever use this type of weapon against someone else. That's slavery. You're putting them into a class that is lower than other people who you're elevating above them and saying you have special rights that trump this person's rights, and therefore at some point, if you did will to do them violence, they would have no means of being able to defend themselves. This is what disarmament has always been about. Disarmament has never been about the actual weapon, whether it's taking that stone away from a Neolithic human being or taking a sword away from a medieval human being or taking a battle rifle away from a modern human being. It has always been about control and slavery. It has never been about just that thing, that particular weapon. You know, sword control back in medieval times was slavery, ladies and gentlemen. It wasn't about the sword, it was about control. Gun control in the modern day isn't about the guns, it's about the control. It's a form of taking away the ability of someone to engage in the self-defense principle, which is a natural human right if they come under attack by violence. And I think it's something that has to be understood at a very deep philosophical level, and unfortunately, not only don't many people understand it, many people seem to have their minds so, dumbed down and so brainwashed by modern propaganda of the state that they seem incapable of understanding this as a natural human right.
Oh, most definitely. And we have seen, if you go back and look throughout history, that's what we've seen. We've seen kings and queens and rulers and whatever just taking over the ability of the average human being to defend their property, to defend their land, because of course it doesn't serve the interest of the tiny few that have, they have maybe more advanced technology, but they don't have the numbers of military or paid military soldiers to go out and enforce these laws that they want to bestow upon the people. So the best thing to do is to keep them starving, keep them working, dumb them down, keep them in fear, and also to keep them disarmed. So, I've studied martial arts my whole life, and a lot of the weapons that I actually train with, they come from farmers, farm tools that they were forced to find a way to develop a weapon they could use to defend themselves because they were disarmed. They weren't allowed to carry the sword, they weren't allowed to carry the spear or to carry the bow and arrow. So they had to develop farm tools and to secretly train methodologies of how to defend themselves. Some of them were even disguised in dances and routines like that, so that if they were working as slaves in the field, it didn't look like they were actually training a method of self-defense, but it was there. So we do see that throughout history, we've always had these rulers trying to enforce these rules, and then we've had these slaves that have constantly been trying to find ways to free themselves. And I don't think that really there's any difference with what we're seeing today.
Absolutely. It's the same thing, history just repeating itself because people still haven't learned the lesson that it was attempting to teach them through the suffering that has always happened in the past through these acts of confiscation of weapons, always inevitably followed by some type of genocide or Holocaust. And all you need to do is do a cursory examination of even modern past history to understand that. How many different societies has gun confiscation been done in the last 100 years, followed by a genocide? Look at Armenia. Look at what happened in Nazi Germany. Look at what happened in the Soviet Union. Look at what happened in Cambodia. It's just unbelievable that people still don't see the pattern. The second biggest world religion is authority. This is the notion that a certain group of human beings or a certain individual, for that matter, doesn't matter whether you look at it as being vested in an individual or being vested in a group. This subclass of humanity has the moral right to issue commands to others. And the others, who are their subjects or their slaves, have a moral obligation to obey those commands that are issued by that a group of human beings. That's called authority. And again, it's just a euphemism. If we're really being honest with ourselves about what the notion of authority is, it is slavery. If we're stripping away all the nice terms that you could call it, okay? If we're being honest with ourselves, the notion of authority that one group of people may command another group of people is called slavery. So I'm an anarchist. I don't believe in the authority of man. There is no authority in man. There is only authority in natural law. The creator of the universe put those laws into effect. So if you want to call it authority in nature, if you want to call it authority in God, if you want to call it authority in moral law, I don't really care. You can call it any of those terms. I'm comfortable with them all. Okay? So that's the authority that I accept is in control of the entire universe. And no man is it. No man or woman is it. So the idea of authority vested in man is called slavery. That was how the ancient world was simply ruled. It was one person at the top, authority vested in one. Everybody else just believed in that authority. That was their religion. That was their God for all intents and purposes, and they couldn't refuse his orders. And he ran a entire subclass of minions that would kill on command. We think we're so different today. We think the world is so different today. The world is nothing, and nothing has changed at all. Nothing. All we've done is change the names. And we've divested that quote-unquote authority. Instead of putting it into the hands of one human being, one person, one being, we've just diffused it a little bit into a group of people who we call government. They still sit up at the top of that same hierarchy of authority and violence. And, the concept of authority is vested in that group. And they rule over all the people who are their subjects or their slaves. And they have a subset of sick, psychopathic individuals who are their henchmen to do their bidding for them, just like the king or the priest king did in the ancient world. And nothing has changed, except we now call it government. Instead of calling it a king or a pope or a priest king, we now call it a government. The authority's been diffused a bit into multiple people that call themselves members of the government, and the subjects are just called the citizenry, and it's ruled by violence in the same way, with the same set class of people who are willing to take orders and do whatever violence they're commanded to do to keep the other slaves in line. Nothing has changed from the old world order to the new world order. Well, you know what? I don't recall ever agreeing to be a slave, held against my will. This is a captive situation. This is a hostage situation. Earth and humanity are in a hostage situation. For people who don't understand that, you're completely asleep. 100% totally asleep. This is a hostage situation that we are in.
Wow,
and
that's...
you know what?
Yeah.
We are here to lead the rebellion against this plantation called life on earth right now. Okay? You were spiritually put here to lead a rebellion against slavery. And the New Age movement has done a beautiful job hijacking that rebellion. A beautiful job. You need to resist tyranny. You need to resist evil. Okay? Not stand down and accept it and let it run roughshod all over the earth unchallenged. That's not being a spiritual human being. That's just laying down. And laying down is defeat, and resistance is victory.
Slavery existed for thousands of years in all sorts of societies in all parts of the world. To imagine human social life without it required an extraordinary effort. Yet, from time to time, eccentrics emerge to oppose it, most of them arguing that slavery is a moral monstrosity, and therefore people should get rid of it. Such advocates generally elicited reactions ranging from gentle amusement to harsh scorn and even violent assault. When people bothered to give reasons for opposing the proposed abolition, they advanced various ideas. Here are 10 such ideas I have encountered in my reading. 1. Slavery is natural. People differ, and we must expect that those who are superior in a certain way, for example in intelligence, morality, knowledge, technological prowess, or capacity for fighting, will make themselves the masters of those who are inferior in this regard. Abraham Lincoln expressed this idea in one of his famous 1858 debates with Senator Stephen Douglas. There is a physical difference between the white and black races, which I believe will forever forbid the two races living together on terms of social and political equality. And inasmuch as they cannot so live, while they do remain together there must be the position of superior and inferior. And I, as much as any other man, am in favour of having the superior position assigned to the white race. 2. Slavery has always existed. This reason exemplifies the logical fallacy argumentum ad antiquitatem, the argument to antiquity or tradition. Nevertheless, it often persuaded people, especially those of a conservative bent. Even non-conservatives might give it weight on the quasi-Hayekian ground that although we do not understand why a social institution persists, its persistence may nonetheless be well grounded in a logic we have yet to understand. 3. Every society on earth has slavery. The unspoken corollary is that every society must have slavery. The pervasiveness of an institution seems to many people to constitute compelling proof of its necessity. Perhaps, as one variant maintains, every society has slavery because certain kinds of work are so difficult or degrading that no free person will do them, and therefore unless we have slaves to do these jobs, they will not get done. Someone, as the saying went in the Old South, has to be the mudsill, and free people will not tolerate serving in this capacity. 4. The slaves are not capable of taking care of themselves. This idea was popular in the United States in the late 18th and early 19th centuries among people such as George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, who regarded slavery as morally reprehensible, yet continued to hold slaves, and to obtain personal services from them and income from the products these servants, as they preferred to call them, were compelled to produce. It would be cruel to set free people who would then, at best, fall into destitution and suffering. 5. Without masters, the slaves will die off. This idea is the preceding one pushed to its extreme. Even after slavery was abolished in the United States in 1865, many people continued to voice this idea. Northern journalists travelling in the South immediately after the war reported that, indeed, the blacks were in a process of becoming extinct because of their high death rate, low birth rate, and miserable economic condition. Sad but true, some observers declared, the freed people really were too incompetent, lazy, or immoral to behave in ways consistent with their own group survival. 6. Where the common people are free, they are even worse off than slaves. This argument became popular in the South in the decades before the war between the states. Its leading exponent was the pro-slavery writer George Fitzhugh, whose book titles speak for themselves: Sociology for the South, or The Failure of Free Society, 1854, and Cannibals All, or Slaves Without Masters, 1857. Fitzhugh seems to have taken many of his ideas from the reactionary racist Scottish writer Thomas Carlyle. The expression wage slave still echoes this antebellum outlook. True to his sociological theories, Fitzhugh wanted to extend slavery in the United States to working-class white people, for their own good. 7. Getting rid of slavery would occasion great bloodshed and other evils. In the United States, many people assumed that the slaveholders would never permit the termination of the slave system without an all-out fight to preserve it. Sure enough, when the Confederacy and the Union went to war, set aside that the immediate issue was not the abolition of slavery, but the secession of 11 southern states, great bloodshed and other evils did ensue. These tragic events seemed in many people's minds to validate the reason they had given for opposing abolition. They evidently overlooked that, except in Haiti, slavery was abolished everywhere else in the Western Hemisphere without large-scale violence. 8. Without slavery, the former slaves would run amok, stealing, raping, killing, and generally causing mayhem. Preservation of social order therefore rules out the abolition of slavery. Southerners lived in dread of slave uprisings. Northerners in the mid-19th century found the situation in their own region already sufficiently intolerable, owing to the massive influx of drunken, brawling Irishmen into the country in the 1840s and 1850s. Throwing free blacks, whom the Irish generally disliked, into the mix would well-nigh guarantee social chaos. 9. Trying to get rid of slavery is foolishly utopian and impractical. Only a fuzzy-headed dreamer would advance such a cockamamie proposal. Serious people cannot afford to waste their time considering such far-fetched ideas. 10. Forget abolition. A far better plan is to keep the slaves sufficiently well fed, clothed, housed, and occasionally entertained, and to take their minds off their exploitation by encouraging them to focus on the better life that awaits them in the hereafter. We cannot expect fairness or justice in this life, but all of us, including the slaves, can aspire to a life of ease and joy in paradise. At one time, countless people found one or more of the foregoing reasons adequate grounds on which to oppose the abolition of slavery. Yet, in retrospect, these reasons seem shabby, more rationalizations than reasons. Today, these reasons, or very similar ones, are used by opponents of a different form of abolitionism, the proposal that government as we know it, monopolistic, individually non-consensual rule by an armed group that demands obedience and payment of taxes, be abolished. I leave it as an exercise for the reader to decide whether the foregoing reasons are more compelling in this regard than they were in regard to the proposed abolition of slavery.
A lot of humans nowadays seem to believe that others who do not tolerate other races are brainwashed or something, and they've got it all figured out, and it's just the exact opposite. Because the so-called racism has always been there, and it's never going to go away, because it's naturally programmed in us. And the people who set up this system of multiculturalism, they understood, of course, that all they can do is cultivate people into being more acceptive, so to speak. But these confrontations are, of course, never going to go away, so there would always be chaos. And in nature, these confrontations would end in death, because if somebody 1,000 years ago, or whenever, went from Europe to South America or somewhere, they would have likely not been just accepted like that. Nowadays people are afraid of the police and so on, and that's a different topic as to why it's even allowed and so on. But the point is, there would have been violence. We stick to our own, just like every other animal, and we protect our territory. The human races are simply different, and that's also never going to change. It's not only the eyes or the skin, it's the hair, it's all the body parts, internally and externally, and this is easy to find out, research it. We are wired differently, and we sense this with our natural senses. As I've said in previous videos, we are in a game. Even if you look at religious beliefs, it's a created reality, a virtual reality with set out rules, which we call nature. And by our natural instinct, and even objective, you could say, we want to dominate. All animals do in some way or another. And slavery is all around us. You just have to open your eyes and look at things from a different perspective. It's pretty simple. We have always used animals for our benefit. Horses to ride, or dogs to protect us, our territory, our house. Or look at zoos. We use animals for entertainment and to profit from them and remove them from their natural places. And I'm not a fan of this simply because it's unnatural. And of course we use animals as food, and there's flesh everywhere. But if you would do that to a human, and there would be humans displayed in a butchery, that's evil and that's wrong and all that. Do you understand what kind of brainwash this is? How we see ourselves, how much we want to dominate. And this is normal. It's normal that we see ourselves like that, and we do not think about others. This is also a so-called racism, except that it's not some kind of brainwash. It's never going to change. As I said, this is humanity. I've never heard of a wolf being called a serial killer, yet they are no different from humans. They cuddle with their family, their friends, and then they hunt and kill. But humans are persecuted for this, for being natural. If people only would understand what's going on in this system right now, especially this whole New Age movement, which everybody is affected by, perfectly fits into the New World Order, but they want to make us believe that it's against it. Logically, it doesn't make any sense at all, but most of our senses are simply not natural anymore, and we are not able to think, and our diets and behavior is affected by this. It's removing us from nature. 80 to 90% of Europeans now eat a plant-based diet, as in they eat mostly plants than anything else, and this has never been like that, and there's disease everywhere, and the brains don't work on sugar and grains, so you've got brain-damaged people, and they are not able to figure this all out.
Dr. Price discovered a substance he called Activator X. It belongs in the fat-soluble group. He recognized that the fat-soluble vitamins A, D, E, and F had been deficient in practically every case of active tooth decay. He found that an essential characteristic of the successful dietary programs of primitive societies related to a liberal source of the fat-soluble activator group, such as is found in seafood, especially fish roe, bird's eggs, butterfat of mammal's milk, organs of animals, and insects. Even though the diets of primitive people differed greatly as to type and source, all diets provided a large increase in water-soluble vitamins over modern diets by at least a factor of 4, and at least 10 times more of the fat-soluble vitamins and mineral activators than the displacing diets of commerce. Quality rather than quantity was the important factor.
The point is that they want you to be a perfect slave, weak and do no harm. That's really what's going on. It's not hard to do this when you remove people from their natural land. Everybody should stay approximately around where they were born, if they were born in their native land, that is. How are you supposed to be healthy otherwise? There's people nowadays from Africa living in Scandinavia. How is that supposed to work? Vitamin D, which is not a vitamin, a hormone, it's required for a lot of things in the body, and everything is interconnected anyway. So if you're missing one thing, you're pretty much missing everything. And especially for the calcium and the phosphorus in your bones. So there's black children nowadays complaining that their bones are messed up, and somehow they are not able to figure out why. Or women here in Germany complaining about back problems who wear hijabs. And this is not a problem related to that. It's more of an example of slavery, because they would also have this problem in their natural land. The thing is that white people can adapt to any place in the world, whereas black people are supposed to stay where the sun is. They're not supposed to move. You can see this as an advantage or not. However, I've never found any humans of a different race, different looking, attractive in any way at all. Never have, since I've been here in this reality. And this is simply because we have all been programmed to be like this, and don't get manipulated by the mainstream to make you believe that you're some kind of racist or anything like that, because this kind of racism is naturally in us, and it's never going to change. Italy, Greece, and Spain, that's already my limit, where women, or men also, just look way too different. It's getting too dark, so to speak. Of course, this has nothing to do with love, and when there's love involved, race doesn't matter, no disabilities matter, nothing at all. Just so you understand, I'm talking strictly about physical attraction.
believers in government, or what I call the supporters of slavery. Look, in all honesty, we even have to drop this term statist. We got to start calling these people what they are. They're supporters of slavery. That's what these people are. Okay, and I don't care what brand they come in, left, right, center, or otherwise. Okay, the Democrat, the liberal, the political leftist, she wants government to be our caretaker from cradle to grave, thinks that government should act as provider and nurturer like an archetypal mother. This is because there's abandonment issues in the motherly sense that are going on in most people like that. And if you go into people who are political leftist, liberal, Democrat types, okay, and yeah, I am generalizing, okay, you will find people with mommy issues, okay? You will find people with mommy issues because what they want the government to be is the caretaker that's absent. So they want it to be mommy. I want mommy. And now government's going to be mommy. Okay? Now let's look at the opposite side, the opposame. Okay? As David Icke calls it, the Republican, the conservative, the political right-winger. Okay? They want government to be our protector. We want a strong government. It's got to be our protector. Police the world and keep us safe. Right? From cradle to grave, it's going to keep us safe, like an archetypal father figure, like the powerful, protective father figure. Well, just like the Democrats and the political leftists have mommy issues, all the people on the right side, who this is what they think government should exist to do, have daddy issues. They want government to be daddy. Okay? That's the underlying psychological issues that these people have and don't even know they have. They don't even know they have these issues. All right? It's mommy and daddy didn't pay enough attention to me. So I want mommy and daddy present now. That's what this is about. That's what this is about. And look, let's not leave out the minarchists. Okay, let me just go back one there. The minarchist, the constitutionalist. This is the libertarian. I only want a little bit of government. I want government to beat me 3 days a week instead of 7. Whip me 3 days a week, master, not 7, please. The plantation on the other side of the hill only whips their slaves 3 days a week. Here we get whipped 7 days a week. So I want to go over to that plantation. This is absurdity. It's absurdity. And again, I don't usually speak that strongly out against these types of groups because they're almost there, but they're the people who are most of the way there, but they fear going all the way because they don't want to be labeled an anarchist. Or in other words, a non-supporter of slavery who thinks that slavery should be abolished. God forbid. Gods forbid.
Let's talk about a really dark topic, overt slavery in early America. Not covert slavery like we're in now, but overt slavery. Some of the most abhorrent practices ever conducted upon human beings. Many of the black slaves of early America and Civil War period America were dissidents because they opposed their condition of overt slavery. Slaves of the Civil War period lived under continuous duress. They were viewed as someone else's property, forced to work under the threat of violence or death, and deprived of the very fruits of their own labor. That's the very definition of slavery. Black slaves in early America were kidnapped from their native lands and brought to America by ships over the Atlantic Ocean in crowded and unsanitary conditions, totally inhumane, unsanitary conditions. Those that even survived the journey across the Atlantic were sold at slave auctions and then taken to forced labor camps called plantations to endure indentured servitude, working crop fields in torturous conditions for the duration of their lives. Many who offered resistance were whipped or beaten mercilessly, hung, burned, or even fed to dogs alive. Laws were passed which barred slaves from escaping a state where slavery was legal to one where it had been banned. Runaway slaves were often hunted and returned to bondage. There were bounty hunters all over the northern states looking for escaped slaves from the southern states. And let me tell you something, folks. This is how the police forces of America started. Yeah, that's not revisionist history, ladies and gentlemen. That's real history. The police were started from runaway slave patrols in the northern colonies. Okay, in the northern states. Yeah, learn some true history. Study about how that really happened instead of some of the alternative so-called theories, conspiracy theories that are out there and wildly off from the truth. There's a true conspiracy. It's not no conspiracy. It's a historical fact. Laws were even passed to criminalize helping or harboring runaway slaves. You could be jailed or worse for even helping them escape. Some Civil War era slaves, such as Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman, acted as dissidents and offered resistance against the practice of slavery by escaping themselves and fleeing to states where slavery was not practiced, and then helping other slaves escape as well. While means such as these certainly showed disdain for their former masters and their abhorrent actions, many would argue that these means undoubtedly still constituted what could only be called passive resistance, since they did not directly take action against those who were conducting such hideous and immoral practices without any right to do so. Now, I'm not saying that they were wrong for doing this. They were tremendous for doing this, okay? But in my estimation, I'm just speaking for myself, it doesn't go far enough. It's still advocating simply for escape to another place where this isn't going to be done to you. How many people still think, well, where can we run to? I'm going to expatriate. I'm going to go down to, Uruguay, or Costa Rica. I'm not running anywhere. I'm staying right here and fighting this evil. Not going anywhere. That's a patriot and a being with courage to fight evil. And if I'm struck down dead, I'll be struck down dead fighting for freedom, true freedom. That being said, I commend their efforts to at least help, move former slaves into a safe area when they had fled their oppression and enslavers, because so many laws and scenarios had been put in place to bring them back into indentured servitude. So they're to be commended at least for that. Who I commend much more and think of as true dissidents against this hideous practice were the slaves who actually physically rebelled against their masters. And let me tell you something, the media was at work as ever, painting it as something that, this was a hideous, horrid massacre in Virginia. God forbid, beings that were being sold into indentured servitude and treated as other people's property were killing the people that did that thing, that horrible thing to them and put them in that condition. How dare they? How dare they kill their masters? Imagine this, the media doing their job. They're paid liars and paid deceivers. They were still at work then as they are today. Some slaves during this time period rebelled physically. There were many slave revolts, most of which were violently suppressed. Such revolts were subsequently downplayed or entirely covered up in modern historical accounts. Every slave ever held under these deplorable conditions and immoral conditions possessed every right under natural law to rebel against, physically rebel against, fight against, and even kill their enslavers. Now, that being said, many of them died trying to kill them. See, once again, I'm never claiming or promising anybody that a physical fight against evil oppressors is going to end well, or possibly even end with the person who's in the right still being alive. I'm just trying to explain to you the right exists. And their behavior was morally right. Morally right. Get it burned into the brain. It was a morally correct and right behavior. They had every right to do this. Some of the more famous slave revolts were Gabriel Prosser's rebellion in Richmond, Virginia in the year 1800. I'm going to skip the Haitian Revolution for a moment and come back to it. The German Coast Uprising in Louisiana in 1811. Nat Turner's rebellion in Southampton County, Virginia in 1831. And John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in Harper's Ferry, Virginia in 1859. The one that was not in the United States proper, but in the Caribbean, on the island of Haiti, was called the Haitian Revolution. And it was the most brutal of any slave rebellion, and arguably the most successful of any slave rebellion. Because let me tell you something, folks, these guys and gals didn't play. They killed their masters often down to the last man, woman, and child with every right to do it. And then they were branded as somehow violent or barbarian, or, oh, they're so, violent, or so, I don't know, a non-human or something. No, they were acting in the way that they have every human right to behave when they're enslaved and oppressed like that. Because no one was coming with reason to help them be liberated, and no one was listening to the reason that the practice of holding them in duress like that was immoral and done without right. So they took up arms and did what they had to do, and you know what? They are absolutely commended by me for doing it, because that's what protecting your freedom is when you don't have any other recourse. And we're going to come to a place like that, and it's going to make the Haitian Revolution look like a little boy and girl's tea party because of what exists, the kind of technology that exists in America. And once again, I'm trying to avert that, but without more teachers stepping up and doing this work, we're going to go right down that path of bloodshed. I'm just trying to help you guys understand what is required. This should not be my voice. I should not be the one doing this, saying this. I should have 10 million choices to tag out to and have somebody else come in and pick up right where I leave off, if I so choose. Or if any of the other people so choose. There should be 10 million teachers worldwide of this information, of natural law. Minimum. I think we can get it done with 10 million. But probably no less than that. And I mean 10 million who know it as well as I know it, who know it as well as former mystery tradition initiates knew it, who knew it like someone like Richard Wetherill knows it, who knows it like someone like Larkin Rose knows it, etc. Like Lennon Honor, like all the other individuals who spoke here today. We need more teachers of true objective morality. I'm looking at you and I'm talking to you. We need to step up our efforts. People have to shed the fear of speaking out and start doing this in a way that you can reach as many minds as possible. I don't care what method you use to do it. You might not like my methodology, you might not like my tact or tone, and I couldn't give a shit. All I care about is that you put the information out that needs to be put out there, so we avert scenarios like this, because they're coming. And it's no joke, and it's nothing to laugh about. And when people recognize what war is, if it comes to this land, I'm telling you, most people are not psychologically prepared, and far fewer are physically prepared. I'm prepared in both aspects, and I'll die today if required, because I've done what I came here to do. You know, I'm fine. I'm fine with, you know, this having been my life up to this point. How many people can say that? Not many. I'm not saying that to, you know, put myself up on any kind of a pedestal. I'm just saying when you've realized your purpose and you've done what you're here to do, there is no fear of death at all.